My name is Justin, and I am an addict. I have been actively working the steps in the rooms of recovery since September of 2013, and am grateful to be sober one day at a time, thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts. RICO 12 is an organization with the mission of learning and sharing the similarities of addiction of all kinds, and gaining and sharing tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. Speakers from our past meetings have represented many fellowships and identify with addictions with such variety as alcoholism, drugs, food, sex, gambling, theft, just to name a few. Friday at noon Central Time, we hold a live lunch hour speaker meeting with a recovering addict from anywhere on earth, pertaining to any or no faith tradition, with any background, who shares their experience, strength, and hope on a specified recovery topic of their choice. For the 12-week period from March 4th through May 20th of this year, 2022, we will be focusing on each of the 12 steps of recovery. Our speaker today will share for 25 minutes or so on his experience with step 4, and then the live audience gets the opportunity to ask questions of him for another 20 to 25 minutes. If you aren't already on the email list to get weekly invitations to join us, please go to reco12.com. That's RECO12.com, and submit your email address there to get the reminders and links. Donations and podcast ratings and reviews are greatly appreciated, and details on doing that will be in the chat of the live meeting and in the show notes of the podcast. If you're listening and feel that RICO 12 is of value, please take a minute and rate and review the podcast in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It's a great way to help get the message out to more addicts who suffer and are seeking tools for recovery. To receiving from the light reflected from our speakers. That light inspires hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us, the listening audience. Now, a quick disclaimer on this series that we're doing here. While we hope these episodes will be helpful to both sponsors and sponsees alike, these 12 weeks of episodes are not intended to replace the necessity of working with a sponsor through the steps. We will not be working the steps in these meetings. They are meant only to be a supplement and informative reference on what the steps mean and why they are important to the individual speaking about them. And step 4 reads, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And Cameron F. is going to be our speaker today on step 4. And here's a little bit about him, a bio he sent me. Cameron F. has been a member of Cocaine Anonymous since November 21st, 2003. As a Big Book sponsor, he has worked with all kinds of addicts from around the world. He facilitates a 12 steps in 4 hours workshop and has carried the 12-step message to recovery to well over 2,200 suffering addicts over the past 17 years. In fact, he just shared with me they've done 4,000 people in the last 2 years on that workshop. His recovery message, quote, it only takes a day to learn the 12-step program and the rest of your life to practice it. He is currently the archivist for Southern Ontario area of Cocaine Anonymous and the archive chair for CA World Services out of Los Angeles, California. Cameron, take it away. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Justin, and appreciate that intro. Yeah, it's about, when I say those numbers of how many I work with, some people think I'm bragging, but it's really, I just want to signify that I've got a lot of experience working with newcomers, and we've taken about 5,000 people. The bulk of them, it's probably getting close to 6,000 now, but the bulk of people we've taken since the boom of Zoom, where we actually went from averaging 20 people a workshop to 200-300 a workshop, and over the 2 years of COVID, we've taken literally about 4,000 people through the steps. So we doubled our efforts, what we did when we started in 2007. But it's about 5,000 people that I've introduced the steps to, and then I've worked personally one-on-one, working through the 12 steps, approximately 385, 86 people over 18 years, and unfortunately 41 are dead. And I bury most people to alcohol death, although fentanyl is making a play for number 2. And I also find in the acting out addictions like sex or love, fantasy, gambling, hoarding, it usually ends in suicide for a lot of those folks. But the end result's always the same for us addicts. The gates of insanity are death. So my name's Cameron. I am a member of Cocaine Anonymous, as Justin mentioned, and that's my home fellowship, although I've participated in other fellowships like CODA, Al-Anon, SLAW, AA, NA, and, basically I've always been of the philosophy that the 12-step program has a great deal of efficacy and healing power for any and all addictions. And, sometimes people get wound up saying, oh, the primary purpose. But, even AA itself, when they created the passage, the jaywalker story, where you substitute jaywalking for alcoholism, well, you could substitute jaywalking for any addiction, gambling, sex, food, cutting, hoarding, and it still reads the same. They actually made the case for any and all addictions in the big book. I find that so ironic. So today's presentation is going to be about step 4. Just to set things up, I'm an alcoholic addict who doesn't drink or use, which is an odd thing for any one of us to signify in the rooms. Hi, my name is, and I don't drink, I don't use, I don't act out. And that's a very odd thing for any of us to say, because if we understand our step 1 proposition that we're powerless over our addictive pattern and life becomes unmanageable and nothing human, nothing secular works, the conclusion is I will drink, use, or act out again. And for me to drink, use, act out again puts me on a trajectory to those gates of insanity or death. And that's a horrifying conclusion. And it's baffling to a lot of us, because we want to stop. We know we need to stop. We want to stop, yet we can't stop. I'll use the analogy, I'm like a dog that returns to its own vomit, which actually comes from the book of Proverbs, where it says a fool in a folly is like a dog that returns to its own vomit. I took the wisdom of Solomon and modified it that the addict is like a dog that returns to its own vomit. I know it's going to make me sick, but this liar, this twist of thinking that I got in my head convinces me and wins the argument every time. It's okay to eat it this time. You're going to be all right. And I succumb to the desire, and I lose more control. I lose more power, and I end up in the gates of insanity or death. And that's an awful thing to come to conclusion with. But then I come into the rooms, and I come across people who are just like me, who've gone down the rabbit hole even further than I have, and they don't do it anymore. And that's a very compelling picture to someone who wants to stop but can't stop, yet meets someone who has stopped. How is that possible? And I was fortunate enough, when I came into the rooms, I met someone who was armed with the facts about themselves. They knew what it meant to be an addict. They knew what it was like to live in that inescapable hole. And through a generosity of spirit and having a common solution, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, they showed me a way out of that inescapable hole. And I've done more in the last 18 years of my life, from the age of 46 to I'm going to be 65 this year, because I drank and used morning, noon, and night from the age of 20 to 46. I've done more in the last 18 years than I did in the first 46 years of my life. In 18 years, I rebuilt a destroyed marriage. My wife and I are celebrating 32 years of marriage this year. The love and trust and respect of my children, who are 35 and 37, and that's a gift the program gives me. My daughter came over to visit, whom I'd been estranged from because I was violent as an addict. And she made us this beautiful beef soup with this really wonderful horseradish sour cream sauce to go with it. Oh, my God. And we have a good time. We play cards. We watch movies. My son has an autistic 11-year-old boy, and for me to be sober for him and be able to help him out with some of those challenges, again, a gift. My liver went back to normal. I went back to university, graduated, topped my class in medical anthropologies and religions, and had the pleasure before COVID traveling around the world. I've been to Sweden, Spain, all across England, America, Canada. Man, like, it is a gift. It is a stellar life being a member of a 12-step fellowship. That's why I like to say I'm a member of a 12-step fellowship rather than being an addict, because there's a big difference between the untreated addict who can't stop, who will go to the gates of insanity or death, versus those of us who are members who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Hence, a member. I love that distinction. So I realized step 2, there is power out there. I see it working in others. So I come to believe in this power based on the testimony of others, the ability to be honest. And where do I find the power? One of the paradoxes of our program. The first paradox is I've got to admit complete powerlessness in order to have power. And then in step 2, I need a power greater than myself, that flimsy reed. But where do we find this power? deep down within us. Another paradox of the program. I really love that, the paradoxes that come out of the 12-step program. And so I come to be willing to believe that I'm going to go through a process, not an event, but a process where my mind's going to awaken, where I'm going to wake up to this notion of a power greater than myself. And then in step 3, the proposition says, hey, if I could show you where this power is, would you go to it? Would you commune with it? Would you listen to it? Would you fire the liar that lives in your head and hire God? And I love that about step 3. God's the principal. We're the agent. I always thought a great business card to hand out in the rooms is, hi, my name is Cameron F., agent of God. How can I be helpful? And we're no longer in our business. We're in the God Inc. business, who's the principal of this company. And we're the employee. We're the agent of God. It really is an amazing job that we're given in step 3. And a lot of people think that quitting, the 12 steps is about quitting. But if you understand the proposition of step 1, we can't quit. I will drink, I will use, I will act out again. Yet I haven't for 18 years. Because what step 3 says is by turning my will and my life over to God as I understand it, my will being my thinking, hence firing the liar and hiring God, and my life, which are my actions, my behavior in the job description under God's employment, just for today, I make the decision to go God's way. It's not just for today, I won't drink, use, or act out, because that's untenable. It's just for today, I'm going to go God's way. And by living life for the day to be honest and pure and unselfish and loving, I access a power. I connect to a power deep down within myself that allows me to easily control that desire to drink, use, or act out. That's the magic of our program. Just for today, I do it God's way. Now, the first tool that we offer, the spiritual toolkit that we lay at the newcomer's feet, the first tool is that flimsy reed, a notion of a power greater than ourselves. And we're not talking make-believe powers here. It's a real power. If you think about the power of alcohol or drugs like heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, the power of sex, sex is the number 2 energy on the planet. There's only one energy bigger than sex, and that's digestion. Right? And these are big energies. So this power greater than ourselves, it better be better than all of that, or I'll always go back to the power I know. So I love about sponsorship. I'm just a broker. I broker the deal between the newcomer and God. God, newcomer, newcomer, God. I broker this deal as a sponsor, and they connect to that higher power, and all sorts of miracles start to occur. Now, the first time I tried to meditate, and those are the next 2 tools that we offer the newcomer: prayer, where we talk to God, where we cue our mind with God. And they have that wonderful step 3 prayer on page 63 of our big book. And then meditation, where we listen to God's direction. That's essentially what we're doing. However, the first time I tried to pray and meditate with God, and I went deep in my mind, there was this racket of guilt and shame over the harms I've done, fears coming up, resentments. And I knew the great reality was somewhere in there, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't connect to it. And so step 4 and 5 is this process where I got to get right with myself. And we do an inventory process. An inventory. Now, this is key. It said, I made a searching and fearless moral inventory of myself or ourselves. 12 steps is a spiritual moral approach to the efficacy of addiction. It's not a secular approach. It's not a psychological approach. It's a spiritual moral approach. That's why it says we do a searching and fearless moral inventory. We're going to tease out the root causes and conditions. Now, our book gives us 4 umbrella defects that we start with, and that's dishonesty, resentment, selfishness, and fear. Those are the big umbrella terms. And we could go with that, But I find in understanding what blocks me from God, because that's what the moral inventory is about. I have certain character defects, certain character shortcomings that block me from having an intimate two-way relationship with the one who has all the power. So I do this inventory where I examine my resentments, I examine my fears, and I examine the harms I've done to other people. And I tease out my part in this, my character shortcomings that exacerbate these problems and block me from a connection to a higher power. And if I'm blocked from that connection, I cannot guarantee that I can easily control my desire to drink, use, or act out. And that's problematic for me. So we do this inventory where we get down to root causes, condition. And, there's step 4 is one of those steps where people seem to really put way too much into it. If you think of the 12 steps as a recipe, each step has an exact measure and set of instructions on how to do it. And then it comes to step 4. People, they throw all sorts of things at it. I remember a person called me up and said, I'd like to do a step 5 with you. And I said, what's wrong with your sponsor? And she said, well, my sponsor doesn't think I have enough resentment. So I said, well, how many resentments are we talking about? And she says, I have 475. And I went, oh my God, and your sponsor doesn't think that is enough? And she said, no, he said I failed to list the resentments I had towards my mother when I was still in her womb. I'm thinking, oh my God, who comes up with this kind of stuff? That's not what step 4 is all about. Sometimes it only takes a couple of incidences in our resentments and our fears and harms to figure out the core inventory that blocks me, the core character defect. So when I work with the newcomer, I go for the big ones. If you think of someone and you hate them so much that you're murdering them and packaging them in your freezer, that's a good person to put down on your resentment list. Or if you think of someone and you wince with guilt or shame, that's a good person to put down on a harms list. And through the resentments and the harms, we can tease out the core fears that drive these character defects. So resentment sets up the template. The first thing we do is we look at, who are we angry at? Am I angry at a person? Am I angry at an institution? Am I angry at a principle? Now, I'm going to share one with all of you, and this is not meant to be in bad taste. It's part of my own self-disclosure. Please take it in the light of trying to explain this process. So I have a resentment towards political correctness, woke culture, and critical race theory. Those things really rub my rhubarb the wrong way. Now, the second thing we do in a resentment is we ask ourselves, why are we angry? Now, interesting enough, political correctness, woke culture, critical race theory, these are principles that I'm angry about. And like I said, it's either a person, an institution, or a principle. So why am I angry? Well, I think it's racist and bigoted, this kind of approach. I think it's hypocritical. I think it's bullying. It's unfair. It's unjust. It assaults the conceptual faculties of the human mind. It's greedy. It's unintelligent. It's doublespeak, in my opinion. And I think it's anti-life and evil. And that's my anger. That's why I'm angry at these set of principles. Now, the next thing we do is we ask ourselves, what is being threatened? How am I being hurt by this principle? And so we look at how we name our injuries, and they give us 5 or 6 injuries. Is it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, our money, our relationships, or sex? Well, in this particular resentment, it affects my self-esteem. People say I'm this and I'm that, and that can affect my self-esteem. I could either go, oh God, I'm wrong, I'm bad, or I could go to arrogance and say, well, screw you, I'm going to do and say as I please, and not care how it hurts people. It affects my security because I could be arrested, I could be fined, which affects ambitions and pocketbook. It affects my relationships. And even, with some of the crazy stuff out there, it can even affect sexuality. So it threatens me on a lot of different levels. Now, the first 3 columns was easy to do. I got a great list of resentments, and I can't wait to share them with someone because I got a lot to be resentful over. And my sponsor said, oh, we're going to discard those first 3 columns. And I went, what? He said, we're going to look at your part, that fourth column. Where am I to blame? What are my mistakes? And I want to identify causes, conditions, defects of character, shortcomings, flaws in our makeup, the root of our trouble, or the bondage of self. And they all mean the same thing. Bill had a real antipathy with using the same phrase or word twice. So he was always using different phrases and terms that mean the same thing, but all they mean are the character defects. So the first thing, now I know I'm selfish and I'm self-seeking, but I want to burrow down. I want to get down to the specifics. So the first thing when I'm working with a newcomer on step 4 is, what's the selfish, self-seeking motive? Why are you angry at this person? What's the motive that keeps your hands around their throat? Well, in lieu of political correctness, woke culture, and critical race theory, my self-seeking motive is, I want autonomy. I want freedom of association, freedom of speech. I want to be a sovereign individual. And in today's context, that really is not a very realistic thing to try to assert. It's not the way society is working right now. So as long as I keep expecting that motive to happen, I stay resentful. So that's the first thing I get an insight on myself about. Then I look at, what's the fear that's driving these character defects? Well, it's fear of authority, because I could literally be arrested or go to jail, depending on what I say or might do. I have a fear of no control. It means the government's in control of my life. It means these principles are controlling my actions in life. And I come from the philosophy, if you want anything done right, you got to do it yourself. And if someone else is doing it for me, that makes me vulnerable. And then my fear of having no freedom. So these fears drive and exacerbate certain character defects. So what are they? What are these character defects? Well, my self-esteem gets threatened, and for me, I go to arrogance, and I exaggerate who I am, and I diminish these principles and the people associated with them, and I get arrogant. And then I go from arrogance, I get into hatred. And then from hatred, I go into moral thinking of what I'd like to do to some of these people. And then I get into suspicion and distrust of everybody. I slander and gossip. I get dishonest with myself and with God and others. I practice civil disobedience. Isn't that ironic? I have a fear of authority. So what's my solution? I'm going to be disobedient, civil disobedience. Oh, that's going to keep the government authorities away. It's like paradoxical intention. I get into non-compliance, leading with the chin. I get irresponsible. I blame others. I play the victim. I get codependent. I need the government to change these principles in order for me to feel okay about myself and to be happy. That's a lousy position to come from. I get intolerant, and then I get misanthropic, where I literally hate my own species, and that's just not good. So what should I do instead? How can I set matters straight? And what I find with step 4, too, in getting the character defects, I want to burrow down to the specific character defect, so that when I'm doing God's will in my day and I find myself in column 4, the bondage of Cameron, and I find myself being civil disobedient or hatred or slanderous or gossiping, I go, hey, wait a minute, I'm in the wrong column. I need to shift back. I'm doing Cameron's will, not God's will, and now I can shift back. Because through the inventory process, I realize what blocks me from God, but more importantly, it shows me where I can access this power greater than myself. How do I do that? What should I do instead? Humility, to know thyself, to know my weaknesses, to know my strengths, to be proactive rather than reactive, to practice acceptance. You know, when I'm resentful, I get resistant. And then when I get resistance, I want revenge. So the process in God's will is through acceptance. It's just the way it is. I can move to forgiveness and ultimately to love. And that's very powerful to be able to do that. So I get into acceptance, forgiveness. I have purer thoughts. I trust. I be proactive. I'm honest. I'm responsible. I become accountable for my own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. I become independent and interdependent. I get compassionate and empathetic. I try to be helpful. I commit my devotion to humanity, to improve humanity, to think critically and strategically, and to do a lot of prayer and meditation and lots of 4s and 5s. That's my way out of it. And that's how I tease out my inventory on a resentment. Now, as I said, I found a fear, the fear of authority. So I love doing fear inventories because I do it like a 5-column process. What's the fear? What am I afraid of? How does it threaten me? What's my part? So my part in the fear of authority is I get civil disobedience going. Now you think about it. You practice civil disobedience. The government's, he doesn't agree with us. Leave him alone. They actually knock on my door with people with guns on their hips. And then the real problem starts, right? That's that paradoxical intention. I love doing fear inventories. And with harm inventory, now I can reverse this. I look at all these character defects I bring to the table, which affects other people, people that want to be politically correct or are trying to wake up and be more sensitive to other people's plight, who recognize that there could be some systemic prejudices and biases within our system that need to be really re-examined and new social policy set forward. I see how my words and my actions can be destructive and affect those people in a way that's not helpful at all. And I'm here to do God's will to be helpful. And then that arouses jealousy and suspicion and bitterness and anger and all sorts of things in these people. And that's a problem because once again, I get blocked from God by doing so. So by practicing the spiritual principles, I can get proactive and I can clean up that trajectory and actually clean up arousing all those harms that I've done. And that's essentially how an inventory works. And then, of course, in step 5, we complete the step 4 by confessing. What I want to hear from the newcomer is that they understand what their column 4 is, the bondage of self, their character defects, and more importantly, what they need to do instead throughout the day. The column 4, the defects, that's my resume as an untreated addict. Column 5 is God's job description for me. Here's another paradox. God hires people with the worst resumes to do his job. That's really a paradox. He hires the worst people. And yet here we go. We go out there with God's strength, our faith in God, and we get reborn into a new way of living and become interested in seeing what we can contribute to life, of how we can be helpful. And man, that opens up a lot of possibilities that are far better than my column 4 self-centered, self-seeking approach. Because when I live there, I get restless, irritable, discontented, bored, and depressed. My liar becomes active, starts working on a reason why I should drink, use, or act out. The liar always wins the argument, and then I'm in real trouble. So that's my take on doing step 4. It's the process that allows us to remove the blocks and where to access God. One last thing I'll say. If all we needed to know was steps 4 and 5, we'd only have 5 steps. If that's all we need to know, what blocks us from God, prayer, meditation, and a connection to a power greater than ourselves, that's all we need to do. But I can't modify my behavior on my own. Cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't work for me. So 6 and 7 gives me a spiritual intervention from God itself. I need divine assistance. And that allows me to move so I can then start making reparations in 8 and 9 and be reborn into that vehicle of 1 to 9, rocket in the 4th dimension, where I have the disciplines of 10 and 11, my daily program of action. And having had the spiritual awakening, I carry the message to the addict that still suffers and practice these principles on a daily basis in all my affairs. And I recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and I become of maximum service to God and my fellows, and I make spiritual progress. And I'm for that. How about you? Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Cameron. Love it. I love the quick process, the quick walk through that, and tying it into the rest of recovery. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, strength, and hope on that. We're now going to jump into the Q&A portion of this meeting. For the next 20-25 minutes, we'll be taking questions from our live audience. If you in the live audience have a question for Cameron, please type it in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window. It looks like 2 speech bubbles over the top of each other. We've got a couple questions that are coming in. We've got one that came in, and I've written down several here, but we look forward to many other questions in this process. So the first question that came in, Cameron, it's kind of a step 3 question, but it leads into step 4, because I need to be, well, my experience is that step 4 is me practicing step 3 like crazy. So the question comes in from Yvonne. Yvonne says, what's the simplest way of handing over my will in one simple sentence? And Yvonne says, I'm in the midst of my addiction.
I say, fire the liar and hire God. That's the nut of step 3, to fire that self-will, lying thinking, and hire a divine consciousness.
Love it. That's very simple and straight to the point. Yeah, that fire the liar. Awesome. Question from Camila. How do we make people accountable without blaming them?
I don't think it's possible to, well, we can hold people accountable. We have laws and that sort of stuff. I find, the best thing my sponsor ever told me, he said at the end of the process, he says, Cameron, go out and share the message with others. And remember, lots of 4s and 5s, lots of 8s and 9s. 4s and 5s facilitate my humility. Here's another paradox too. When I do an inventory, I literally, in order to do the inventory, I have to be in column 5. I have to get honest. I have to get responsible. I have to be accountable. I have to, be pure in my thinking and all that, all the things that are needed to do an inventory push me into that 5th column. I live in that 5th column in order to do the inventory. So inventories is a way of rubbing my nose in my own character defect, rubbing my nose in the futility and the totality and the destructiveness of those character defects. And in that process of waking up, I start to look at what I take accountability for my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And more importantly, I get proactive by communing with my higher power to give me the strength to live and continue living in that 5th column, so my life flips upside down, and man, it's just a stellar life.
So quick question on that answer, and maybe I am misinterpreting this. You talked about it, doing this process is a good way of rubbing my own nose in my own mess, and kind of saying that. What is the difference of doing this in a step 4 and living in a shame spiral? Is there a difference there? And what are your thoughts on that?
Now, what's your it's interesting enough, this is the second time in 24 hours I heard someone refer to a shame spiral. Now, and I used to always remember the shame spiral from Stuart Smalley from SNL, where he talked about, he was the codependent, and he talked about shame spiral. What's a shame spiral? Can you give me a definition?
Yeah. So, I just used that term. I don't know where I got it, but, sometimes when somebody starts beating themselves up and feeling shame about, their actions and stuff, they kind of go down the toilet bowl and start beating themselves up worse and worse and worse and worse.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I get like that, when I get really despondent and really down on myself, and I get misanthropic towards my life and the lives of others, that's my cue for inventory. What's really going on here? Well, self-esteem is being threatened, and for me, in a shame spiral, it's self-deprecation, self-loathing. What's the way out of that? Humility. Let's get responsible and accountable as to who I really am. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? It's also dishonest, right? Because whenever I'm caught up in column 4, I'm either exaggerating who I am in arrogance, or I'm diminishing who I am in self-deprecation. And both sides of that false pride is based on half-truths and innuendos, and it distorts the truth of the picture. So I do inventory to get to the truth, to get honest, who and what I really am. And that, of course, requires me to be responsible, because when I blame others, then I play the victim, and it's a position of no power and lack of power. That's my dilemma. But taking responsibility for how I think, which determines how I feel, and thus how I behave and what I become, then I take responsibility for that, and I become accountable for the results I get in my life. And when I'm in a shame spiral, I take accountability, because my thinking is off track. I'm in half truths, false pride. I'm diminishing who I am, and thus I experience these feelings of deprecation, and then I shut down and I procrastinate and I isolate and all that sort of stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much for running through that. I appreciate that. Another question from Allie. Allie says and asks, what do you do with resentments that keep coming up even after doing a thorough steps 4 and 5?
That's a great question. I have certain resentments in my life that I've been working on for 18 years. And this is where the spiritual progress comes into play. I've gone from seething, blind, murderous rage to having moments of resentment. And by doing inventory, I continuously rub my nose in my own shit. And I see how futile, fatal, and destructive it is for me to live with that resentment. And it forces me, it raises my consciousness of what I need to do in column 5 to take accountability and to be responsible. And this is what I need to do to get to a place of acceptance, which then leads to forgiveness and ultimately love for those that I'm angry at. The other thing, Allie, I find, and so when I lose my center and I get into the resentment, inventory brings me back to center. But the other thing that brings me to center is prayer and meditation. There are certain people here locally for me that I don't like very much. There's an animosity towards them, and I've done inventories on them. But when I'm centered, when I start my day with a good meditation and I'm centered in God's will and I'm focused on column 5, when I think about these people I have generally had animosity towards, I'm in that position of neutrality. I'm safe and protected. I'm neutral. And I can actually have genuine empathy and concern for these people. As it says in our sick person's prayer, we realize like ourselves, they were sick too. And that's how I handle certain reoccurring resentments. One, it tells me I'm not centered and I should get centered, because then I get that position of neutrality. And if it's really some of these resentments, I can brush off. I'll think of someone and I'll get angry and I'll brush it off. Others might be a little more entrenched. So I'm going to pause. As my good friend Nikki and Camille always say, go to pause land and pray. And sometimes it really gets under my skin and I'm really angry and I'm cussing and I'm swearing and I'm all bent out of shape. And now I put pen to paper and I'm drawing columns and I'm scraping it like barnacles from the hall.
Great. Love it. All right. So I'm going to take there's a couple of questions here that are somewhat similar. I'm going to combine them into one. So if someone was hurt by another, and there was no apparent fault of that individual, like, for example, as a child, maybe I was molested by somebody. First part of that question, how can we find our own faults in that? And the next part is, how do we forgive somebody who maybe has harmed us when we had no part in it that we can find?
Well, that's a good question. Okay. As an innocent, there's no part a child plays in a heinous crime of that nature. There's no part whatsoever. I remember I worked with a man who was raped as a 5-year-old boy. He was 48 years old when we were doing the process, hopeless alcoholic. And we got into this particular situation, this resentment. And he goes, well, I'm not really sure what my part is. I really don't play any part as an innocent. You were just violated and victimized. And he says, well, do you want me to go into the details? I said, absolutely not. Now, this is more of a step 5 instruction. I said, absolutely not. I'm not skilled as a therapist to have you go into childhood trauma and reveal that to me and have me piece you back together in a more psychologically viable construct. That's what a therapist does. And that's the properly appointed authority to hear that stuff. But I will hear your inventory as a 48-year-old man who's used a 43-year-old incident to justify a life of self-pity and resentment and anger and hatred and victimization and irresponsibility. We'll talk about that as a 48-year-old adult. But the childhood stuff, that goes to the therapist. And that's an important distinction to make. That's for their protection and your protection. You know, I saw a great movie. It was called The Shack on Netflix. It was a Christian show, but it was all about a man whose daughter was taken, and it's inferred that she was probably molested and then murdered. And this man was so resentful. And he's on this mystical journey to try and reconcile this anger that's destroyed himself and his family. And he meets this shaman. This mystical shaman appears and is trying to guide him on this journey. And they find the bones of this guy who killed his daughter. And he's so full of resentment. And the shaman says, forgiveness doesn't bind you to the relationship. It frees your hands from their throat. And see, forgiveness doesn't justify the heinous act. It frees us from being bound to them. And I'm bound to them because I have a self-seeking motive that can't be fulfilled, and it's futile, and it's fatal to me and everyone in my life. And it's through inventory that I see that futility and fatality. And the first step is acceptance. Acceptance that my daughter was killed, acceptance that a very heinous act was committed, a very sick and disturbed man. And through acceptance, I can find a vehicle to let go and eventually forgive, where I can free myself from that toxic relationship, and then ultimately reach a point of being just unconditionally loving. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but that's kind of the trajectory I map out when I'm dealing with resentments. First is acceptance, then forgiveness, and then ultimately love. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think it's helpful to know that, hey, it's easier said than done. It may not happen overnight. Eventually, it may happen overnight, but it may be a night a long ways away. Another question from an anonymous attendee. They asked, if I'm working step 10 every day, why would I do another step 4?
Yeah, that's a good distinction. You know, step 4 is the instruction where we initially do an inventory. A lot of people have never done inventory, although ever since the 90s, with the advent of the New Age movement and all these kind of wild things that people are doing spiritually, a lot of people have done some self-examination, some self-introspection, but a lot of people have not. And so step 4 and 5 is our initial house cleaning. You know, in step 10 and 11, you know, it's actually, we're doing step 4 and 5, but it's in step 10 and 11. And typically we're trying to keep just today clean. So we do an inventory of the day. My step 10 is basically my inventory of the day. Was my day pure and honest and unselfish and loving, or was my day full of dishonesty, fear, self-centeredness, and resentment? You know, and so step 10 is the daily inventory. What's been going on today? 4 and 5 is about everything that's happened and cleaning up the past. I hope that makes for a good distinction. But essentially, it's the same process or instruction. One is just doing the whole life so that we get right with ourselves up to this point. And then 10 and 11 is our daily program of action.
So thank you, Cameron. You mentioned something towards the end of your share that really hit me, and I think this is important for me to give myself a little bit of grace and understanding for the imperfect, quote, wicked person that I am in my life. You mentioned that God hires the worst people, the most wicked people, to do his work, and I think we can see that, at least as I look through holy writing that I consider holy through, I have a Christian background, so the Bible is kind of where I look at. But like you mentioned, Moses, Jacob, David, Peter, Paul, all of these people were messes, and yet God uses them. Can you share a little bit more about why that is maybe more powerful that way, and how that can help me, you, others give ourselves a little bit of grace in our own imperfections?
Can I get you to just kind of re-clarify that question? So what are you looking for specifically?
Yeah, so you mentioned that God works with the worst people. He hires the worst people to be his agents. The question, I guess, is how does that bring me, how can I have a little bit of grace with myself, knowing that God works with imperfect people and that I can actually be an agent of God in my own life, despite the terrible things I've done?
I remember, and this is a step 8 and 9 question, or it's also part step 4 and 5 too. When I'm doing harms, and I remember this one person said, well, I have no amends to make. I've forgiven myself for everything. And I thought, well, isn't that convenient? Right. Step 9 promises alludes to it. It says, before we're halfway through, we're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. I don't forgive. I've never really forgiven myself. I don't know even if I can forgive myself for the awful things I've done that I can't correct. I can't give back my children from the age of 4 to their young adult life the experience they had with me as an untreated addict. I took that from them. I don't know how I could ever forgive myself for being that kind of man. But in my effort to make amends and to be the best father I can be now and the best husband I can be to my wife now, God has bestowed a grace upon my being that allows me to shoulder that burden and utilize my contribution at this point forward to be helpful. And I experience God's grace, God's forgiveness. God forgives. Well, and I know that we're getting kind of abstract there, but that's the way I kind of construct it and work with it and what I've experienced.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think this next question that I have kind of builds on that a little bit. I am currently working my step 4 with my sponsor in another fellowship, and I'm experiencing this, and I've seen it be experienced by many others. Just this real emotional, hard, lots of fear, lots of negative emotions, coming swimming in and bearing down on me. How during that process of doing step 4, how do you make sure that you and encourage your sponsees to push through that and to maybe see it from a third person point of view? I don't know if that's helpful there, but what are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question. First of all, when do most people go back out? It's usually when they do their step 3 and the sponsor goes, okay, now go do an inventory on your resentments, fears, and harms. Come back when you're ready. And they disappear. A lot of people don't want to face that on their own. So, and I take it case by case. And by the way, I only give a person 24 hours to work out their inventory. When I do the step 3 prayer with them and we commit to going God's way, they've got 1 day to put it together. And then the next day we delve into steps 5, 6, 7, and 8. So if they're really sketchy, I'm going to try and work it out with them right now. I'm not going to cut them loose. They're not going to face it on their own. So let's do it together, arm in arm. Let's go find God together in the process. So tell me, who are you resentful at? Okay, and why are you resentful? And they'll start talking about it. And then I might throw some clarifying questions or prompts in there. And how does that threaten you? What does that injure you in your life? And now let's look at your part. And I facilitate them teasing out those character defects and getting down and getting specific. And we do the journey together and then illuminate where the power is in step 5 or column 5. So if they're really sketchy, I'll do it with them. If I'm reasonably confident they can take a look at the big resentments and the big fears and the big harm, I give them 24 hours to do it. And the next day we get together and work it out. So that's how I approach it. I go for the key thing is I go for the big resentments and the big harms. The fact that you took $10 out of your mother's purse when you're 12 years old isn't why you're smoking crack. Right? There's usually other resentments far more pressing that need to be looked at. And the big resentments and the big harms tease out the biggest cluster of character defects that are problematic.
So I assume that, that time that I took $10 out of my mother's purse a long time ago would end up on my step 8 and 9 though, correct?
Yeah, here, Mom, here's the $10 I took out of your, that was me. I took it. You didn't lose it. I took it.
Right.
Been bugging me all these years.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Have another question from Allie. What if a person is saying that you wronged them, but you don't see the same reality as them? How do you figure out your role in those cases?
Oh, good. Well, first of all, it's kind of dicey working out resentments with another who has a resentment towards you. I remember a woman called me up and said, Cameron, I need to make an amend to you. And I said, really? I didn't even know you harmed me. She said, well, I had a lot of resentments towards you. And then she started to proceed to tell me all the reasons why she was angry at me. And before she got through the list, I'm calling her all sorts of misogynistic names, slamming the phone down. And now I'm drawing columns and I'm working out my resentment. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. Yeah, we all see things from a different perspective too. You know, I'm a big believer. Sometimes it takes two to see one, you know, because I have blind spots that I might not see. And someone can point them out to me. Cameron, my friends Nikki and Camilla have pointed out my blind spots over the years and have been very kind and generous in doing so, because it takes courage to point out a blind spot in someone else, because they might react strongly against it. But yeah, depending on the nature of the resentment, I find better to have a third party to work it out with than confronting the individual directly. And remember that the steps are about reparations. My part or their part in my resentment has no bearing on it. What's my part, and what can I do to make it right? And yeah, there's some people that have opinions about me that I don't agree with, but that's just where they're at, and this is where I'm at. Yeah, I hope that answers it to some extent.
Thank you, Cameron. Appreciate that. A question came in that maybe I just don't understand this. Maybe you do, as I ask this question. This person from the live audience says, my qualifiers picture is on my phone. Should I delete that? Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yeah, I get that. Okay. Now, you got to ask yourself, why is your qualifiers picture on your phone? Especially if you got a resentment towards them, every time you look at it, it's going to remind you of your resentments. And if you're not working a program, that's just going to exacerbate your irritation and your impatience and your judgment. And then the liar starts working, hey, we need a solution to this restless, irritable, discontented position we're in. And that's why we should drink, use, or act out. So it's not an avoidance strategy. You just got to ask yourself, what's the real motive for keeping a picture of your qualifier on your phone? Now, if you have to still interact with this individual, I can understand it, but you don't have to have its picture. You can just have their name, if anything. But I would take a deeper look at the motive. What's the motive for keeping it?
All right.
I'll give another example. I had a woman I was working with, and she got really enamored and obsessive with me. She actually called my wife and said, you've emasculated your husband, and you need to step aside and let me have sex with Cameron so I can heal him. And my wife's going, oh, the bleep is this. And she started sending me these really beautiful hats, because I like to wear hats. And I really loved the hat she sent me, but I'm not keeping them because that qualifies me. That's a qualifier. It binds me to that relationship, which is toxic. So I returned everything.
Thank you for sharing that. And that helps clarify some things in my mind too with that question. So I appreciate that. All right. We have a couple of comments that came in, and then we'll roll into closing this up. First one is from Leonard. He says, thank you, Cameron. I always learn from you with prior learnings deepened and reinforced in emphatic ways. I know perhaps no one has ever said you're emphatic, but I see it. And he says, I so appreciate what you've given me. And then Nikki, and we both just love Nikki. Cameron, you made that amends to your children when you sponsored me and saved my life. You helped to save my life. I'm someone's daughter. You paid your sins forward. And she just says, thank you. All right. Any other words of wisdom or anything upcoming that you would like to share with us, Cameron?
Every last Sunday of every month, we do a workshop from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we literally outlined the entire program of action in 4 hours, giving the participants a lick of the ice cream cone. I always found that it takes a long time to work through an entire big book. And a lot of people don't, I think of doing steps in 4 hours, kind of like soul surgery. We're like soul surgeons. We're doing triage. And so we literally get a chance to experience each one of the 12 steps in a 4-hour period. And I've watched people literally pop and flip upside down in 4 hours. It's really quite extraordinary. And in 4 hours, you'll learn the scope and breadth of a 12-step program, how to live the program daily in steps 10 and 11, and how to carry the message to that poor individual stuck in the hole that doesn't know their way out.
Awesome. And for those of you who are wondering how to get in on that workshop, go to www.12stepsforhours.org. That's the number 12 steps, the number 4 hours.org, and you can get all the details there. Very good. So let's start wrapping this up. Thank you so much, Cameron, for this. It was a great RICO 12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. If we didn't get to your question, or if you have other questions, please go to rico12.com/forum and join in our community and ask those questions and answer others' questions that may come in. I invite the audience to come back next week. If you've not yet rated or reviewed the podcast, please go do so now. It's a great way to help out with and work your step 12. Next week, we will be covering step 5, and Eric H. will be our speaker then. He's excited to share about his step 5 experience, and it should be a great meeting, and I look forward to seeing you all back here next week. Now, let's launch off into the rest of our day with the we version of the Serenity Prayer that Cameron will be voice for.
I love the we version of the Serenity Prayer because it signifies what God does for us that we can't do for ourselves. A great American sponsor, Mark Houston, used to tell this story of a guy that goes duck hunting with his friend. And he takes his dog and they shoot a duck and it drops in the middle of the pond. And the dog gets up and walks on the water and picks up the duck and brings it back, and his friend doesn't say anything. Shoots another duck, drops in the middle of the pond. The dog gets up, walks on the water, picks up the duck, brings it back, and his buddy still doesn't say anything. So he turns to his friend and says, "Hey, do you see anything wrong with my dog?" And the guy goes, "Yeah, that dog can't swim." Missing the miracle of God, of the dog walking on water. Well, this is the miracle we see in the rooms. Most addicts, when they come into the rooms, they're unaware, they're asleep. And that's why our stories are important. When you have an opportunity to share your experience, strength, and hope, there is an ear. Every member has a story, and there is an ear somewhere in the fellowship that desperately needs to hear your experience, strength, and hope, because it signifies that there is power. There is power available. There is recovery is possible. And we bear witness as recovered addicts to that power. And that's what I love about the we version of the Serenity Prayer. So on that note, the we version, God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. God bless you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cameron. Keep coming back, everybody. It works when I work it. So work it. You are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight, still searching for of life and bind it with a seal.